Okay, good evening Year 11 and welcome to the night before news in preparation for paper 2 of the Maths GCSE, which is the first of 2 calculator exams. Before we get stuck in, it's worth pointing out that predicting what will come up in paper 2 is quite challenging because there's no sort of constraint over what can come up in paper 2 and what can come up in paper 3. There is an amount of content left and all of it is just as likely to come up in one paper as it is in the other. Predicting paper 3, quite easy because by then there's one paper left and we know what content hasn't been addressed. But we're going to do a little bit of unpicking in this video of what's come up so far and what sorts of things are likely to come up in the next 2 exams. You need to be preparing for as much of this as possible to make sure if it comes up in the exam tomorrow that you're ready for it. So without further ado, if we start by looking at what came up in paper 1, and I've not listed everything on here, I've listed a fair bit of what came up in paper 1, things that are most relevant. It is quite a lot. And I'm going to talk through what that means for our preparation for paper 2. This was a little while ago, so a bit of a reminder here. You had some very easy things early on, as you'd expect, so ordering decimals, won't come up again, but you could now have ordering fractions or ordering negative numbers. Negative numbers came up, calculations with negative numbers. We knew that would come up in paper 1, that you wouldn't really need to worry about it in paper 2 and 3 because it will continue to come up, but you can use a calculator. Solving equations, you had very little on solving equations, and actually this is true for a lot of algebra skills from paper 1, so expect more, expect harder questions. For example, solving equations with x on both sides is something that we'd absolutely expect to see and we haven't seen yet. Parts of circles, it's quite a nice one, I think, to be able to tick off now. It's possible that it could come up again, but very unlikely. Listing factors, similar, won't come up again. Angles around a point is just about the only angles question that you had in paper 1, which was a surprise. So we're definitely expecting to see a lot more on angles in parallel lines, angles in polygons included in that. Similarly, coordinate geometry has come up now. Which we were very much ready for in paper 1. Don't think it will come up again now in paper 2 or 3. What I mean by that is like midpoints or just putting coordinates on a grid or equations of basic lines. Money, you will get more money problems, so don't think that that's now ticked off, but just a reminder that that was in there and will continue to come up. Arithmetic and estimation are 2 examples of things that we were very much expecting in paper 1 that you no longer need to worry about because they don't come up in calculator exams. You had a mean question, not as in like a horrible question, like a question on mean, which was very straightforward, unexpected really. I wouldn't tick off averages yet as something that will no longer come up. You could still get mean again even. It could be that it's from a frequency table or a group frequency table, so we want to make sure we're ready for that. But also nothing yet on range, median or mode. So make sure you're ready for those 2. Algebra skills, like I said earlier, there weren't many and there will be a lot across the 3 papers. So there was quite a small proportion of algebra actually in that first exam in total, and there should be quite a big proportion of algebra across the 3 papers. So that would suggest that we're going to get a bit more than expected in paper 2 and 3. Fractions is something that you don't need to worry about in paper 2 and 3. If they come up again, which is unlikely, you just use a calculator. The thing that you do need to be able to do though is fractions of an amount. That's a really important skill. We saw it come up loads in last year's exam. You had a very easy recipes question, which was very nice. I'm not expecting to see that again, but there's plenty more in ratio and proportion that can come up. So similar skills like best buys. Percentages, you will get a lot of percentages still. In last year's GCSE, it came up 9 times in total across the 3 papers. It came up twice in paper 1, it came up twice in this paper 1 as well, and then it went on to come up 3 times in paper 2 and 4 times in paper 3. So it might be that we see something really similar there. Percentages is a huge topic that's well worth doing some revision on to make sure you can get all of those marks. Writing a formula is a skill that's come up in a couple of the predicted papers for this exam. But it came up in paper 1 and I'm very much not expecting to see it again. Nth term came up in paper 1. That's a very specific skill, so not expecting to see it again, but that doesn't mean we can ignore sequences. And you can get other sequences questions where finding the nth term can be very useful. You had a single question on volume and surface area, if you can remember the question about a cube. Quite a specific type of question, so you could definitely still get some more volume. I think volume is something that I'm still expecting to see. Surface area, less likely, but still possible. And then there's some statistical graphs here: frequency polygon, Venn diagram and set notation, and scatter graphs. You wouldn't expect to see any of those again, the exception being Venn diagrams. So the one you had to list the individual numbers in the right place in the Venn diagram. But you can get Venn diagrams questions where there's just a frequency in each part of it, so it counts. And there's no reason why that couldn't come up potentially. There was very little asked about probability within those questions. So, you could get another Venn diagram with a probability question. Equally, there are lots of other statistical graphs that haven't come up yet. So still expecting to see those. There was a lot of statistics in this first paper though, looking at that. So probably not expecting as much now in papers 2 and 3. You had a pressure question, which is a compound measure, but you haven't had any speed or density questions. So very much expecting to see at least 2 of those across the next 2 papers, but possibly 3 or 4, possibly questions with units changing, because again, there was no unit conversion in this paper at all, which is crazy. We've seen unit conversion in every paper ever for a really long time, so I was really surprised by that. You had simultaneous equations, a 1-mark graph question that I know a lot of you were talking about when you came out of the exam. Again, simultaneous equations could come up again because it was only 1 mark, and like I said, there's very little algebra in the first paper. Simultaneous equations could be a way of getting some more algebra marks in. And then finally, probability trees, which is part of that statistics and probability strand. You had a very straightforward probability tree question. It was 2 marks, and it was decimals, and it was independent probabilities. So there's plenty of room for them to make another probability tree question potentially. It's no guarantee at all, but maybe one with fractions, maybe one where the probabilities change. If you remember those sorts of questions where someone takes a sweet out of a bag and eats it, and then they go to take another one out. So depending on what colour sweet they take out at the start, the probabilities then change moving forwards. It's quite a lot of information there. What's probably more useful to look at is the list of things that I do think will come up in these next 2 papers, and you have had access to this for a while, but I just want to talk through it one more time. It's important, again, to point out here that topics that have come up already can come up again. There's no guarantee that they won't. Even things that historically have never come up more than once, they could come up a second time. But I'm going to focus here on the things that I think are most likely to be seen now. And again, this doesn't mean that they're going to come up in the exam tomorrow. They could come up in the one next week. But obviously we want to make sure we're ready for anything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the strands one at a time. And the topics here are listed in order of how likely they are to come up. And this is based on quite a lot of statistical analysis of previous GCSE exams and the topics that come up more or less often, and also looking at what strands have come up a lot and what strands haven't come up very much in the papers to see if things are then more or less likely. So starting with number, you had a lot of number in paper 1, which is pretty normal. So there'll be a bit less coming up in paper 2 and 3, which again is pretty normal. It's a calculator exam now. However, there are some things that we were expecting to see in paper 1 that we didn't get, and some things that we know will never come up in paper 1, so are very likely to be in paper 2 and 3. From the top, standard form, very surprised not to see any standard form in paper 1. You will have standard form questions, whether they're this paper or the next one, I don't know, but make sure you're ready for standard form. Converting in and out of standard form. Calculations in standard form are a bit easier now that they haven't come up in paper 1, because you can just use a calculator, but you do need to make sure you get your answers in correct standard form, so be ready for that. Rounding and place value, you will get a rounding mark somewhere. If a question says to give your answer correct to a number of significant figures or a number of decimal places, you don't need to round. You can put more digits. It avoids you potentially losing a mark for rounding incorrectly. If a question says round your answer to a number of decimal places, then that is something that that needs to be done to get the mark. Place value would be something that could come up on the first page, something really straightforward. Use of a calculator are those questions when you're given quite a complex calculation and you just type it into your calculator and you hit equals and you get the answer, and it'll often tell you to write all of the digits of your answer. This is something that can be tied in with rounding quite often, where you get a part B that then asks you to round it. I mentioned earlier ordering fractions. Where it says fractions and decimals, we have had ordering decimals, but fractions with decimals, with percentages, is something we haven't had. And also the use of inequality signs, you know, your crocodiles, if you like, to state that one value is bigger than another. Normally when we order fractions, we make the denominators the same. You don't need to do that in a calculator exam. You can quite easily change a fraction into a decimal by just typing that fraction into your calculator, hitting equals and using the S to D or change button. Money problems, I've already mentioned. Highest common factor and lowest common multiple, not seen in paper 1. Again, a little bit of a surprise. Very likely now to come up in one of the 2 papers that we have left. Error intervals didn't come up in paper 1. Extremely likely to come up. These things are in order of likely to least likely. They're all quite likely, to be honest. You can see there's not a lot of things on this list. Types of number. You were asked to list factors in paper 1 and that was it. So you've not had anything on prime numbers, square and cube numbers. Reciprocal is something that we've seen a lot in GCSE papers for the last few years. So make sure you know what a reciprocal is and how to find it. It's easy with the calculator. And product of prime factors, low on this list, but again, very likely to come up, probably as part of highest common factor and lowest common multiple. It's actually factor trees. So yeah, lots of good topics there. I do think all of them are likely to feature at some point, so you're going to want to make sure if there's anything there that you're not sure about that you can shore it up a bit tonight. And then probability and statistics, there's not a lot left here, and like I said, there was a lot that came up in paper 1. Certainly probability hasn't featured a lot. I've included probability trees still on this list because I do think it's likely to come up again, but probability tables is the big thing that will come up at some point. I'm just going to, wait for that to stop. Probability tables, hugely common. We've seen it in a lot of the predicted papers that we've provided. Averages from frequency tables, as I mentioned earlier, could be group frequency tables. Comparing distributions, that's that question for 2 marks, where you need to compare the median and compare the range. You could get that tied in with some of these statistical graphs. Something like a stem and leaf diagram is quite a common style of question for that comparison of distributions. That's you lot being noisy out there, by the way, getting ready for your English exam. 2-way tables, pie charts, and frequency trees. They won't all come up, but any of them could. And there's more statistical graphs here, excuse the typo that you can see there, graphs. But bar charts, Venn diagrams, again, possibly. Pictograms is one that I wouldn't be surprised to see at all. It was in last year's exam, could come up again this year. And probability scales is a basic thing, but putting the X in the right place on the line, again, something we haven't seen yet, so something that could still come up. Now, the big section here is geometry, and you've got very little geometry in paper 1. It isn't one of the bigger strands. It will make up 15 to 20% of the GCSE, but the fact that there's been so little of it means we are expecting quite a lot of this to come up in paper 2 and 3. Area, make sure you know how to find the areas of these different shapes. You know, area of a triangle, base sum side divided by 2. Parallelogram, base sum side. Trapezium, a plus b divided by 2 times the height. Really important that you're confident doing those, and they're quite easily revised from Hecate. Transformations will come up again, I'm sure. Probably twice. Sorry, I say again, it didn't come up in paper 1 at all. Unusual. It will come up. Probably once in each paper, maybe twice in one and once in the other, so quite a lot of marks there. Trigonometry wasn't going to come up in paper 1 with SOHCAHTOA, but you know, very likely now, so do get ready for it. Area and circumference of circles, and where I've said part circles here, I don't mean naming the parts of circles again. I don't think that's likely to come up, but finding the area of a semicircle or a quarter circle or circumference perimeter as well. Pythagoras, again, will come up. These are still things that are very high up on the list, very likely. Angle facts will come up. Angles and polygons will come up. Angles and parallel lines will come up. and some of those things combined for some 4, maybe 5 mark questions. So good things to practice. Volume, no longer guaranteed, strangely, because it technically came up in 2 different questions in that first paper. You had the question of the cube, but you also had that cylinder question at the end with the pressure question. But I still think you're going to get more volume. Column vectors, from this point on, things are now less likely to come up, but some of them will, just not all of them. Column vectors, really, really easy. It's worth making sure you've had a look at them. Plans, elevations, a little bit more niche, can be really easy. Some people find it quite awkward. Similar shapes and congruence. Congruence, remember, is just 2 shapes that are identical. You could get a really easy 1 mark question for that, but you need to know what congruence means. The shape can be rotated or reflected, but if it's the exact same shape and size, then that will be congruent. Similar shapes are where they're bigger or smaller versions of each other. Naming shapes is something that we haven't seen yet that has been quite a theme in previous exams, so wouldn't be surprised at all if you're asked to name some sort of polygon or some sort of prism. Yeah, be ready for that. Properties of shapes as well. This thing about parallel and perpendicular lines has become quite common in GCSE papers now. So identifying a line that's parallel to another, make sure you know what parallel means. Make sure you know what perpendicular means. Make sure you can list, you can't quite see it there, my head's annoyed, how many faces, edges or vertices a 3D shape might have. We've seen a lot of that. Bearings is surprisingly low down on this list. When you look at analysis of past papers, it doesn't come up every single year, which is why it's lower down. I think there's a very good chance that it comes up. You haven't had anything on scale drawing yet, and bearings is a really good way of doing scale drawings questions, so be ready for that. With that come things that you might need to measure with a ruler and then convert into a real life size. Constructions and loci, I wouldn't necessarily, sorry, there's the alarm again. I wouldn't necessarily revise constructions and loci at this stage. It's just reminding you that it's there. Things like perpendicular bisectors with a compass or constructing triangles. We've seen a couple of bits in some of our predicted papers. And surface area, very low down on this list because it's come up, but it's still there. It's still something that could come up again. You certainly haven't had like a conventional surface area question, like find the surface area of this cuboid or this triangular prism. So things to expect there. I know I've been talking for a long time, but these lists are really important. The next one is ratio and proportion. You've had very, very little on ratio. In particular, like 1 to n is a really common skill in GCSE papers. You will get more ratio, be ready for it. Questions where you draw boxes to help you, something that I'm expecting to see. Calculations involving time. I didn't know that this was as common as it is, but when you go back through GCSE papers, they come up loads. And that might just be you working out how many minutes between 2 different times, or someone leaves their house at this time and takes this long to get somewhere, what times they arrive. Could be questions that involve reading a bus timetable, for example. It could be that that's involved in speed, distance, time calculation. So lots of possibilities there. Unit conversions is huge. Didn't come up at all in paper 1. I will bet money now that it's going to come up in paper 2 and paper 3. So make sure you know how to convert between all of those different units for meters, litres and kilograms. Proportion, so you had the recipes question but you haven't had best buys. Currency conversion is another big one that is very, very common in calculator exams. Compound measures I mentioned earlier, speed and density, possibly a tricky combined problem for 4 or 5 marks at some point. Fractions of amounts I mentioned earlier, you might be asked to do that backwards as well. Fraction, decimal, percentage conversions, again, very, very common questions that we've not seen yet. So can you change a fraction to a decimal, a percentage to a fraction, those sorts of things. Percentages, basic ones at some point, finding a percentage or amount or doing an increase or decrease, but then also your harder reverse questions there that you can see at the bottom, less likely to come up, but I still think you'll get at least one. Simple and compound interest, very likely that you'll get at least one question on one of those things, but possibly both, possibly a couple of questions on one of them. Conversion graphs, fairly straightforward, very similar to the way a scatter graph works. We have had a scatter graph, but I still wouldn't be surprised to see conversion graphs again. And scale drawings, which I have mentioned, questions where you need to measure. The one that people will always remember is the question where you have to estimate the height of the man and then use that to estimate the height of the tree. So that sort of thing has also become quite common in the last few years. And then your algebra strand. This is the big one. I think there's going to be a lot come up from this. Not necessarily everything, but possibly some of these things coming up a couple of times. The big surprise here is that sequences, I mentioned it earlier, still right at the top of this list, even though it came up in paper 1. Sequences questions with diagrams has become a bit of a theme in the last couple of years, so I wouldn't be surprised to see that again. And actually, if you go on ExamQ and you type in sequences with diagrams is something that comes up in that drop down, so you might just want to have a look at those questions and make sure you know how to do those. That will set you up really well for anything that could come up in paper 2 or 3. Linear equations, mentioned it earlier, going to come up, going to get some harder ones. Simplifying skills, collecting like terms, you've had it, but it will come up again. Multiplying and dividing will come up again. Index laws will come up again. So make sure you're all over your basic algebra. Plotting graphs is a huge skill that didn't come up in paper 1. Could be a linear graph, could be a quadratic, could be something else even, but one where you have to fill in a table of values and then plot the graph on the axes. Big mark opportunity there. Factorizing, including questions where you factorize into double brackets, solving quadratic equations by factorizing. I've not had any of that in paper 1, it will come up. Expanding and simplifying equally will come up, including double brackets. Substitution, rearranging, function machines, where you've got an input and an output. Again, all things that we haven't seen yet, all things that will come up. Simultaneous equations remains on this list, but is no longer a guarantee. Identifying types of graphs, not a guarantee, but could come up. And then inequalities. I mean, it's low on this list, but I would be surprised not to see it. There are quite a few different types of inequality question that you could get, and you've not had any yet. And y equals mx plus c. Not a hugely common topic, but wouldn't be remotely surprised to see it come up in your exam. So make sure you understand what part of that is the gradient and what part is the y-intercept. How will you calculate gradient? Changing y over changing x. All things that could definitely come up in the next few papers. That was a lot of information. You might want to go back through that and make some notes and some things that you know you need to do some work on tonight, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're actually going to do that work this evening. So, spoke about this before paper 1, 2 approaches you can take being either looking at specific topics or looking at practice papers, and kind of discussed how the second approach would be the better one, because anything could come up at that stage. The balance shifts over slightly now to where looking at specific topics is probably a good idea, because there are things that we know are very likely to come up because they've not come up yet, and you can make sure you're ready for them. Hegarty maths is one very easy way of revising specific topics. It's not good for everything, but it's good for a lot of the things we've discussed, especially those algebra skills. ExamQ is probably the best place now to be revising topics ready for this paper tomorrow. Just remember to change this filter to foundation, because by default it always says higher. When you look for papers, make sure you put in paper 2 and paper 3, because anything that's come up in paper 3s in the past could very easily come up in a paper 2. And then you've got the topic search down there in the bottom right that you can use to be finding those specific things. And then Maths Genie, same as before, you can go to either of these 2 links on Maths Genie and they'll take you to a list of topics. So feel free to go and have a look at those as well. If you want to look at practice papers, past papers are no longer a great source of revision for this exam, because they will include things that are no longer likely to come up. However, predicted papers are the very best thing you could be looking at. If you want to do more general, broader revision, then predicted papers are the way to go. I've put everything that we've done in the last 2 weeks on Arbor. So it's all there for you. Do go back and have a look. You might have missed things. You might have had exams clash with some lessons that we did the week before half term. You might not have done some of the resources that we used over half term. These ones in particular are the best ones, and there's a lot here. Maths Teacher Hub is a fantastic resource that a lot of you will have done on Monday, where we had the extra period 5 and we had people in period 3 and period 4. It's got 41 questions. They're all things that are very likely to come up in the next 2 exams. Pixie Maths have made a good predicted paper. It's on Arbor. In fact, they've made 2. One that we used before half term and one that we used during. First Class Maths has made a very good predicted paper. And Maths Genie is the paper that we've used period 5 today. If you weren't in the period 5 today, you're mad, but make sure you do this paper. Maths Genie's got a very good track record for predicting questions quite well. Doesn't mean they'll come up tomorrow again, could come up in paper 3, but they'll all be good questions, so make sure you know how to do those. If you haven't done those 5 predicted papers yet, do them. It's the best way to get yourself ready, and we'll do the same for paper 3. As soon as paper 2 is done, people will be hard at work making predicted papers. We'll be hard at work analysing the paper and seeing what's come up. And then we'll have a really good week of getting ready for that paper 3. Final reminder about tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning's huge, okay, really important. And I think before paper 1, a lot of you got a lot out of that time and came out of the exam, and I had conversations personally with people that said, oh, thank you for going through this with me because it came up in the exam and I wouldn't have been able to get those marks. It really can change your grade, what you do tomorrow morning, as well as what you do tonight, of course. So reminder first of all, the hub is open from 7. Lots of the resources that we've used will be down there, so it's a great opportunity to go back through things and find stuff you can't do. But equally, bring with you questions from your revision tonight that you've got stuck on. Someone will help you go through them, which is that point there. Line up will be at 8:25, and then we'll be back in the conservatory in the hall looking at the conservatory in the canteen, looking at these breakfast warm-up grids. These questions are the ones from paper 1, but the ones that we've got for you for tomorrow have been made since paper 1. They're chock full of stuff that is all very, very likely to come up in one of these 2 papers. So again, get stuck in, find things you don't know how to do, get hold of a maths teacher, get them to teach it to you. It will make a difference. It has made a difference already for lots of people in paper 1, but I'm aware of some people that missed opportunities because they didn't buy into that last opportunity quite as well as they could, or they did the work independently and just did the things that they found easy, and that's not what's going to help you at this stage. You know, find the stuff that isn't easy, find the stuff that you are stuck on, and get the help you need. Okay. Last thing for me to say, of course, is good luck. I say good luck. It's not luck. You know, if the paper tomorrow is horrendously difficult, it's not a big deal. It will be difficult for everybody. If it's really easy, great. It's going to be easy for everyone. The work that you do in this next sort of 12 to 18 hours is what will make the difference. There's not really any luck involved. It's hard work. Effort trumps talent big time when it comes to this paper, because we do know a fair bit about what's going to be coming up now. You can make decisions that will improve your mark. That's it. Just make the right ones. Work hard tonight. Work hard in the morning. Get the help you need, and you'll smash it. See you then.